what happens when sheer boredom unlocks an impossible fortune. A system glitch allowed one individual to siphon off an astonishing 1.6 million, fundamentally changing everything for them. This sudden digital wealth shattered their old life and forced others to see them in a terrifying new light. At the center of this spree was someone who started by testing limits from a state of tipsy ennui. Slowly, those initial failed withdrawals ballooned into an unchecked cascade of transactions, building a fortune that felt too good to be true. But the story doesn't end there. The fluorescent hum of the ATM panel flickers over Dan Saunders' knuckles as he stares at the illuminated digits 1-600-000. The number isn't just wealth, it's a sudden, dizzying weight pressing down on his chest, making every breath catch in his throat. How does this impossible influx of zeros transform a man whose daily routine involves wiping down sticky bar tops? And what internal battle forces Dan Saunders to confront the stranger staring back at him in the reflective glass? This improbable surge in his account balance was not a fluke. It was an active invitation, a digital door swinging wide open just for Dan Saunders. As he stood there, 3 hours north of Melbourne, the mundane reality of Wangaratta dissolved into high-stakes fantasy. How could this glitch transform the life of a bartender working just $20 an hour into an intoxicating whirlwind of perceived wealth? Leaving the sticky floor of the bar and Wangaratta behind him, Dan Saunders walked out toward the glow of the machine, already feeling the electric buzz of possibility thrumming through his bloodstream. He approached the ATM not with hesitation, but with the focused intensity of a hunter closing on prey. This was more than just needing cash for the week's expenses. After a quick series of taps and withdrawals, a small ritual of confirmation, the 29-year-old knew the rules had been rewritten in Silicon code. The initial validation spurred a relentless addiction. Dan Saunders couldn't just walk away from that perfect withdrawal amount. He plunged headfirst into testing the parameters, pushing the ATM beyond its intended limits like a desperate gambler on the edge of his seat. This discovery wasn't enough for mere curiosity. It became an imperative to drain every last sliver of digital possibility before the system could patch itself shut. He stood before the machine in Wangaratta, watching the digital ledger on the ATM screen surge upward like an unchecked tide against a stone wall. His humble salary of $20 had just evaporated into near infinity. The sheer impossibility of those numbers, far exceeding what his savings account held, ignited something deep inside Dan Saunders, shattering the quiet contentment that usually settled over him after a long shift. This wasn't mere extra cash. This was proof that the rigid rules governing his life were negotiable, and he possessed the key to cheat them. The initial rush of possibility demanded immediate execution. Dan Saunders didn't just test the glitch, he weaponized it. He began systematically draining the system, turning abstract digital numbers into tangible stacks of crisp currency that felt impossibly heavy in his grip. This newfound capacity to summon wealth on demand fueled a reckless consumption spree, setting the stage for an extravagant 5-month siege against financial reality. The floodgates were open. 5 months of unchecked financial euphoria followed that initial strange withdrawal, transforming Dan Saunders' reality from routine shifts at the bar to perpetual VIP status. He began treating his phantom balance not as theoretical currency, but as liquid possibility, throwing extravagant parties that pulsed with bass and glitter. Chapter 1: Tangible Evidence of Power. The euphoria wasn't just abstract numbers, it was tangible evidence of power. Dan Saunders threw back champagne flutes at gatherings, the laughter ringing brittle and bright against the backdrop of his newly inflated bank account. He didn't just fund parties in Wangaratta, he began paying off friends' university fees with a flick of his thumb, instantly erasing years of academic strain from their shoulders. On a night out from the Wangaratta bar, Dan Saunders first encountered the system's hesitation while attempting to check his balance. The machine flashed back an immutable message: balance unavailable at this time. Driven by suspicion, a quiet itch beneath the surface of his ordinary life, he initiated a $200 transfer from his credit account into savings. only for the terminal to spit the card out with a definitive metallic transaction canceled. He walked past that very ATM again, the cold glass surface reflecting his slightly blurred image. Driven by a cocktail of late-night restlessness and curiosity, Dan Saunders slotted his card in once more. He pushed the limits further than just testing the waters, sending another $200 across to itself before watching the machine dispense the cash with mechanical indifference. This initial successful withdrawal ignited a fever pitch inside him, a small victory signaling that this wasn't a glitch but an open invitation. He initiated a test withdrawal of $200 from his savings account. The machine, instead of rejecting the request outright, dispensed the crisp bills into his waiting hand. Back in the bar, the immediate gratification felt like a small jolt of illicit power, and Dan Saunders continued drinking as if nothing had shifted beneath the veneer of normalcy. Then came the escalation. Another $200 transfer resulted in cash appearing perfectly stacked in his hand, followed by a boulder push to pull out $500, then an even more audacious attempt for $600. It felt less like banking and more like performance art, a sequence of effortless magic trick where Dan Saunders was the sole conductor, pushing the system's tolerance until it buckled under the strain. Chapter 2, Itch Demanding Validation. Walking away from the familiar metallic glow of the ATM, Dan Saunders felt an itch under his skin, a persistent hum demanding validation for what he witnessed, where he slid his card back into the reader slot. A nervous habit taking over the moment he initiated another transfer request, pulling out $200 again, but this time, instead of just testing the limit, he was probing the very seams of the software itself. The cash spilled into his waiting palm, clean and crisp, as if conjured by some silent agreement between him and the machine. The next dawn seemed too mundane for a reality so sharply altered. Dan Saunders initially dismissed it as fever dream logic, but when he reached into his pocket, the weight of spent bills felt undeniably real. He called the bank just to confirm the ledger's truth, and staring at the screen, the familiar $2,000,000 read more like an invitation to chaos. This small discrepancy told him everything. There was a lag between the machine's immediate accounting and the bank's hard balance, meaning every dollar he spent could be covered by preemptively manufacturing it overnight. The paper proof felt solid, heavy against his palm, showing exactly $2,000 in debt, a tiny scarlet flag signaling insolvency to the world. Dan Saunders immediately surmised this discrepancy was merely lag time. He envisioned the mechanism. Every dollar spent, or he could simply fabricate through a calculated overnight transfer. He began testing the parameters, knowing that if he stayed one day ahead of the system's inevitable reversal, he could begin building an illusion beyond comprehension. Chapter 3, Suspected Only a Lag. He suspected only a lag, a momentary stutter in the massive digital machinery of the bank. The suspicion birthed a simple plan to cover his tracks before anyone noticed the gaping hole where his savings should be. He learned that by strategically initiating transfers between his credit and savings accounts sometime between 1 and 3 a.m., the dead zone when ATMs went silent, he could effectively create wealth out of thin air. By staying one full day ahead of the system's automatic reversal, Dan Saunders could force the digital ledger to believe he possessed an inexhaustible fountain of cash. The initial $2,000 vanished immediately. Dan Saunders used it to celebrate his digital victory by buying several rounds of drinks for patrons at the bar. That immediate expenditure became an anchor in the rising tide of fabricated wealth, fueling the intoxicating surge that convinced him this wasn't a fluke but a permanent elevation of his station. Then came the necessary countermaneuver. On the second day, Dan Saunders pushed $4,000 savings account, an immediate injection designed to prevent that red balance from staring back at him like an accusation. This strategic nightly transfer acted as a digital anchor, ensuring the system wouldn't snap him back into solvency just yet. By timing this deliberate float ahead of the expected reversal cycle, he began tricking the bank's ledger into believing his account held millions, not mere scraps. The intoxicating thrill of watching the digits climb, A simple key press sending his balance soaring into the stratosphere felt like Dan Saunders had stumbled across fire in the dark cave. That sheer, instantaneous power, that digital alchemy became profoundly addictive. It was an urge to witness the impossible happen again and again. He couldn't just feel rich, he had to see it bloom on the screen after each withdrawal, a visceral confirmation of his new reality. He immediately poured nearly $1,000 into the joint account for his wife. This initial gesture cemented the fantasy, making the newfound millions feel less like phantom code and more like tangible security. The intoxicating pull was immediate, an adrenaline rush mirroring that of a caveman finally striking flint to bring forth fire from the darkness. Chapter 4, Mundane routine dissolves into performance. The world shifts on its axis when the money arrives unearned. Suddenly, the mundane routine of tipping customers at the bar dissolves into a dazzling performance. People treat him differently then. A subtle tilt of the head from the bank teller to a conspiratorial nod across the counter. He remembers one interaction vividly, standing before the counter in Wangaratta watching his own figure reflected in the glass. He saw that shift happen in her expression. It was instantaneous awe colliding with professional neutrality. The shift in perception was immediate, palpable. Strangers stopped walking past Dan Saunders at the Wangaratta ATM as if he were a temporary monument to fortune. At the bank counter itself, when the teller saw the staggering figure, the $6 million reflected on his screen, her professional veneer cracked, replaced by an outright, stunned admiration that felt heavier than any withdrawal slip. Friends, too, began to reassess him. Some voiced their skepticism like a dull warning bell, while most eagerly hitched themselves onto the updraft of his perceived success. The smile of the bank teller behind the glass, a subtle lift at the corners, a sudden widening in her eyes became a constant mirror reflecting Dan Saunders' newfound status. She didn't just process his withdrawal, she validated it, transforming the simple transaction into an acknowledgement of his inherent worth. Suddenly, when he asked for $20,000, the question ceased to be about procedure and became a prelude to admiration. The chatter among his peers transforms from cautious skepticism into immediate endorsement. Friends who hesitated now cheer the spectacle, treating Dan Saunders' newfound balance like a thrilling, shared roller coaster ride. He spins those fabricated narratives, investment banker, real estate guru, like practice sound bites when cornered by new acquaintances, knowing they cared little for the mechanics of his fortune as long as the illusion held firm. Chapter 5, Enthusiastic Chorus treats Windfall. The quiet murmurings of his circle, the tentative, "You shouldn't be doing this," vanished, replaced by an enthusiastic chorus that treated Dan Saunders' windfall as inevitable destiny. People began shouting encouragement across the crowded bar stools at Wangaratta. They weren't questioning the source anymore, only celebrating the spectacle. They saw not a bartender who had found a glitch, but a man finally seizing the reins of his own narrative. Dan Saunders kept that explosive reality, the one for $6 million floating on his screen, a tight secret from his family, knowing their disapproval would arrive like a cold draft in Wangaratta. Instead, he built elaborate narratives around himself for anyone who asked. An investment banker, or perhaps real estate guy, a convenient one-liner to satisfy the curious gaze of strangers at the Hilton. Where he kept the secret locked away from those closest to him, his family would have immediately delivered that familiar. Or he'd sigh, the kind that precedes judgment. But he guarded it fiercely because their disapproval felt like an anchor dragging on the euphoria of the digital riches. Instead, when meeting acquaintances, Dan Saunders spun elaborate fictions. An investment banker, or perhaps a venture in real estate. A polished one-liner meant to convey stability and success without inviting scrutiny into his actual life. As a 29-year-old bartender, the sheer weight of that hidden reality, the gap between the man washing glasses in Wangaratta and the high-stakes performance pieces for anyone who dared ask about his career. The bank itself seemed to possess a collective blind spot. It allowed this digital sleight of hand to continue for 4.5 months without so much as a flicker of internal alarm. Dan Saunders wrestled with the constant gnawing fear that his secret was just one wrong keystroke away from exposure, sometimes even manifesting in waking dreams where SWAT teams materialized at the front door of his hotel room in Melbourne. That terror would always peak when the doorbell chimed, leading him to brace for the inevitable arrest, a relief he didn't even know he craved, only to find a maid offering pristine fresh towels instead. Chapter 6. Digital Hammer Blow Against Facade. The internal tremor began subtly. Every ring of the phone felt like a tiny digital hammer blow against the carefully constructed facade of Dan Saunders' normal life. He started answering those calls instantly, even when he craved silence, because some small, horrified part of him prayed for the call to be the final curtain drop, a definitive announcement that the charade was over. Life had fractured around this unseen glitch. His existence became a loop where bank tellers would ask pointed questions about specific locations, and Dan, unable to lie convincingly, would simply confirm, "Yeah, that's me." The relentless pressure mounted until sleep itself became an interrogation. Dan Saunders began to dream of the inevitable reckoning, seeing SWAT teams already breaching the door of his temporary Hilton room. He would wake up drenched in sweat, convinced the sirens were approaching, that this was the final curtain call on his ordinary life. But then, the mundane chime of a hotel doorbell would interrupt the panic, revealing only a maid offering fresh towels. The bank calls became an inescapable tide pulling Dan Saunders under. Every time the receiver buzzed, a fresh wave of adrenaline surged through his veins, forcing him to confirm his existence to strangers miles away. He would answer them, accepting their polite scrutiny. "Did you just go here? Or did you just go there?" And lie in wait for the verdict on his precarious reality. The bank tellers began to treat his transactions like exotic wildlife sightings. They would pause, their gazes tracing the movement of money across the screen as if Dan Saunders were performing a miracle at the counter. When asked, "Did you just go here? Did you just go there?" Dan Saunders answered with a flat confirmation, yet the slight hesitation in his voice betrayed the lie he was selling them. Then came the chilling reassurance, "No worries, just checking it's you," a quiet dismissal that felt heavier than any accusation could have been. Chapter 7. Look inward instead of outward. The constant murmur of institutional concern eventually forced Dan Saunders to look inward instead of outward. A question began to echo in the cavernous space behind his eyes. Who was he really? He had pushed this financial anomaly too far, stretching the digital leash until it threatened to snap back and wrap around him like a noose. The internal monologue intensified, morphing from mere anxiety into a relentless interrogation of his own core being. "Who are you?" Dan Saunders demanded of himself, questioning if he was simply Dan from Australia or one of those cinematic figures destined to vanish with the millions in his wake. The pressure mounted, demanding an answer beyond the flashing digits on the screen, a solid declaration of values for this man who had played God with a ledger entry. The weight of the deception grew too heavy to carry silently. Dan Saunders sought out a voice in therapy, needing an external anchor against the rising tide of his own guilt. His initial encounter was met with a polite shrug from the first psychiatrist, a dismissal that stung like a poorly aimed dart. But eventually, he found counsel in another man who offered not advice, but quiet direction. The initial advice from the first therapist, a hesitant declaration of unqualified expertise, felt like a small, inadequate dam against a surging flood of self-doubt. Yet when Dan Saunders found the second psychiatrist, that man offered not judgment, but direction. He didn't dictate the escape route, simply underlined the necessity of accountability, positing that a formal admission would be the only true path to settling his conscience and finally setting him free from the invisible chains of fraudulence. The sensible psychiatrist didn't prescribe action, he prescribed intention. He planted a single heavy seed of advice in Dan Saunders' mind. Turning himself in was the necessary clearing agent for his conscience. That quiet suggestion became the fulcrum upon which his entire fraudulent reality would pivot. Chapter 8. Seed of Self-Reporting Takes Root. The seed of self-reporting took root, urging Dan Saunders toward public confession. This internal push drove him directly to the pages of the Herald Sun, where he laid bare his windfall for the first time. He didn't stop there, however. That single print admission felt insufficient against the roaring chaos in his own head, compelling him forward into further media confrontations. Dan Saunders knew that simply whispering his story into the void would be insufficient. He needed an audience capable of believing the ephemeral shimmer of those inflated numbers. He contacted the Herald Sun, placing his predicament onto glossy newsprint, forcing the local narrative to shift from whispered rumor in Wangaratta to headline fact across regional Australia. The sheer weight of that fabricated wealth, the numbers swimming on the screen, made Dan Saunders feel like an imposter at every interaction, or even when paying for coffee in Wangaratta. He wrestled with the notion that since nobody else seemed to notice the $1.6 million phantom balance, perhaps the money was never truly stolen, but merely existing outside the ledger's accepted reality. This rationalization provided a fragile shield against the mounting guilt. He wasn't robbing anyone. He was just borrowing from an invisible bank vault that held no records of his true deficit. He struggled to reconcile the digital glow of $1.6 million with the reality of pouring lukewarm beer over sticky bar mats. Dan Saunders felt his core identity fraying like cheap rope under sudden strain. He genuinely could not grasp that this vast fortune was merely syntax, a sequence of ones and zeros, until it manifested as a physical object, a sleek sedan, or an expensive bottle of scotch. The logic spun in his mind. If the bank system itself hadn't truly materialized those dollars, then how could he claim to have stolen anyone's actual hard-earned cash? Chapter 9, Vanishing Act on Majorca Coast. He imagined his escape route wasn't just a flight across the Atlantic. It was a deliberate vanishing act, settling somewhere on Majorca's sun-baked coast where the casinos operated like silent sentinels, with their velvet ropes and hushed patrons guarding secrets only they knew. Dan Saunders felt that if he moved the cash into those high-stakes rooms, the money would become tangible again, shielded by the opaque hum of slot machines and whispered wagers. He couldn't stand the idea of having his balance displayed publicly at every transaction, a constant accusation staring back at him from the teller window. Dan Saunders didn't truly believe the money belonged to him until it started moving, tangible proof flickering across the digital ledger, or until he used it to purchase something or see it shift into another account. The raw numbers on his screen felt like ghosts until they materialized, proving their existence beyond mere algorithmic suggestion. He convinced himself that since no one was noticing a deficit, perhaps the money had never actually left the bank's ethereal holdings. He had convinced himself that because no one at the bank in Wangaratta was raising alarms, this mountain of zeros didn't actually exist, or it simply occupied an invisible space on the screen. This quiet conviction allowed Dan Saunders to operate under the theory that he wasn't stealing anyone's funds, but merely accessing a temporary pocket of digital possibility. He carried the weight of that assumption like a shimmering, unsustainable halo, letting the logic of unseen shield him from the crushing guilt that clawed at his ribs. The phantom glow of that bank balance haunted Dan Saunders even when he was wiping down sticky countertops at the bar. Every spilled cocktail felt like a potential thief snatching back his ill-gotten fortune. He found himself caught in a strange, dizzying cycle, or kind of high-stakes emotional whiplash akin to Macaulay Culkin's post-holiday disorientation, one moment an undisputed king, the next just another service worker tethered to the fryer basket. The return to the grind, sloshing drinks, wiping down sticky countertops in Wangaratta felt like waking up from an impossibly vivid dream. Dan Saunders found himself battling a bizarre emotional pendulum swing, feeling simultaneously euphoric and profoundly hollow. This stark contrast was jarring, akin to Macaulay Culkin after a triumphant stint with Home Alone 2, where the dizzying high of untouchable wealth suddenly plummeted into a heavy, confusing normalcy. The phantom glow of that bank balance haunted Dan Saunders even when he was wiping down sticky countertops at the bar. Every spilled cocktail felt like a potent reminder of what his fingers could conjure from thin air. The return to the grind, sloshing drinks, wiping down sticky countertops in Wangaratta felt like waking up from an impossibly vivid dream. Dan Saunders found himself back in the mundane rhythm of servitude, but something fundamental had shifted within him. The frantic transactions ceased in June of 2011. Dan Saunders consciously pulled the plug on the digital faucet, halting the daily influx that had propelled him toward one bond. He walked away from the intoxicating flood, choosing instead the slow, deliberate return to his baseline existence, a decision that felt less like surrender and more like a necessary recalibration of the soul. This conscious withdrawal was not an admission of failure, but the first defiant act against the system's false promise.